Thanks for joining us today. I'm Reena. I'm an independent journalist covering design and business. I've written for Business Week, Harvard Business Review Online, Fast Company, the New York Times, and a bunch of other places. And I can't imagine a better panel for this topic that we're going to be discussing today, or a better format. As you see, we're at Steelcase using Mediascape, which is one of the newest technologies and environments being used by universities and a lot of other educational institutions. So I just wanted to address a couple of things. You can watch this live streamed online at 360.steelcase.com. And we're also looking for questions from people who are joining us virtually beyond New York, Toronto, and Washington, D.C. Via Twitter, you can use the hashtag 360discussion. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists here in New York. We have Jim Keane. He's the president of the Steelcase Group. Hi, Jim.
Hi, how are you?
Good to see you in person. In Washington, D.C., we have Daniel Pink, as you know, the best-selling writer and author of A Whole New Mind and Drive. Hi, Daniel. Nice to see you.
Hi.
And in Toronto, we have Roger Martin, who's the dean of the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto. Hi, Roger.
Hi, Reena. How are you?
I'm doing very well. So we are going to start out with just brief presentations. If everybody could just talk about their work and some of your ideas around this topic of educating the creative thinkers and leaders of tomorrow. And Jim, why don't we start with you?
Well, thank you. And Steelcase is proud to be able to host this panel discussion. It's a great topic as things are changing so quickly in business and things are changing so quickly in education. I think this topic of business education is just this intersection between all of that change and a very important topic for us as we think about improving competitiveness of our workforce and our organizations going forward. I'm president of Steelcase Group. Steelcase is a global manufacturer of furniture, architecture, technology products. Much of our research goes into how the sociology of work is changing, how the sociology of learning is changing, how technology affects those things, and we spend a lot of time trying to understand topics around collaboration, for example. What happens when groups of people come together to collaborate, particularly very diverse groups that cut across different disciplines and take on some of the complex challenges we face today, as well as what happens when individuals have to work effectively. You know, we're beginning to realize that people are very different, and different people need different ways of working, different ways of learning. It's been interesting that the research into learning and work have uncovered a lot of these same patterns. And then Steelcase's job is to take all that and to understand how space fits in, how physical space of an office, a classroom, a campus can either get in the way of what people are trying to do or can actually enhance it, help people do it more easily, do it more effectively. So this topic is on our minds all the time, and we're excited to be part of this today.
Great, thank you. Daniel, would you like to talk a little bit about this topic, just give us some background on what you're writing and thinking about now?
Sure, thanks, Reena. So I'm here in Washington, D.C., and we've tried to simulate a congressional hearing. So I'm here with Rick is my lawyer, so he'll be advising me certain questions not to answer. But in a bid to emphasize the creative aspect of this, I have backup singers here. So what I do, I'm like you, Reena, I'm a writer, and what I write about is work, the endlessly fascinating subject of work, something that we spend over half of our waking hours doing. And among the things that I think connect to what Jim is doing and also what Roger is doing are sort of two broad baskets of ideas. One of them is that in advanced economies, the sorts of abilities that used to matter the most, these what we can think of as quintessentially left brain abilities, the spreadsheet abilities, they still matter, but they matter relatively less. And it's the harder to outsource, harder to automate, inventive kinds of abilities, artistry, empathy, big picture thinking that now matter most. And I think there's a pretty significant tilt in favor of those directions. What Steelcase is doing is helping enable that kind of work to get done, which I think is a different form, not different in degree, but different in kind, and requires literally a different architecture, both in terms of our systems, but also in terms of the physical elements of our workplace. But then it also requires a new approach to education, a more integrated approach, very much like what Roger is doing. At the same time, one of the other big trends going on here is we're seeing in some ways the poverty of certain kinds of motivators in the workplace. That is, these classic kind of carrot and stick motivators, what I call if-then motivators. If you do this, then you get that. They're terrific for the simple, algorithmic, routine, rule-based work. But there's 50 years of science that says they just don't work very well for the more creative, conceptual, integrative work that most people are doing today. And I think one of the challenges of organizations, I also think that in some ways those controlling carrot and stick motivators are inconsistent with human nature. And so I think one of the interesting things going on in the world of work today is how do we come up with motivational schemes that go with the grain of human nature. And I think the same thing is true in our physical workplaces. How do we come up with physical workplaces that go with the grain of human nature rather than some of our workplaces which were architected for a very different kind of work and that in many ways go against the grain of human nature. And so I think these are all great issues, and they're issues that I love because they matter in people's everyday lives.
Fascinating, thank you. Roger, could you also fill us in on what's new at Rotman and what you've been researching? You have a book coming out in May. A little bit about
Sure.
that would be terrific.
Sure, be glad to. One thing I have to say right up front is you're going to be hard pressed to find Dan and I thinking about different things differently. I would start by just saying I agree with everything Dan has just said, and in fact, what we're trying to do at the Rotman School is model our education on some of the things he mentioned. So I do think that business education, for the most part, is still oriented towards the world Dan says we've left, which is it's teaching students analytical techniques for deciding between known options. So if you've got option A that's presented to you and option B, you can crunch all the numbers and very kind of consistently and rigorously come up with B is better than A or A is better than B and be really great at that. It's just that's not the really, really valuable thing. I don't think it's ever been the really valuable thing, actually, but it certainly isn't anymore if it ever was. What's really valuable, and I think anybody who thinks about the people in their organization, they'd say, oh, the really valuable thing is when it appears there's option A and option B, and somebody in my organization says, no, there's a C that nobody's tried yet that is just plain better than A and B. And I think everybody would quickly say, yeah, that's when I'm really happy. That's when you've got an architect in your firm. You say, wow, that was a great piece of work. That having been said, right, I would say most of business education is distinctly, definitely not about that. It's about, and the way I'm thinking about it more and more is that if you actually think what goes into that form of thinking and education that produces that person who can figure out whether A is better than B or B is better than A, is the manipulation of quantities. Right, so all the exercises that you do, all the things that you would do to be able to say, yes, A has got a higher net present value than B or a higher IRR, internal rate of return, than B, is about techniques for manipulating quantities. It's the Black-Scholes option pricing theorem or the capital asset pricing model. Those are all techniques for manipulating quantities. For coming up with something that's truly new and different, I think what is required is the appreciation of qualities, right? Which is to be able to have a sense of, and certainly for the architects here, a sense of, is what I'm doing going to be beautiful? Yes, you need so many square feet, a quantity for per office or the size of the building or whatever, or for the elevator shaft. Those are quantities that you have to actually be able to manipulate, but what makes a building, a workspace, wonderful or not is appreciation of qualities. What's the feel? What's the sense? It's easy for me to say, I have fewer backup singers than you do. I can count the backup singers, and that's a quantity, but who cares, right? It's more what's the quality of the dialogue, what's the quality of the experience. And again, if you think about the vast majority of education now, and business education would be similar, it's manipulation of quantities. And if you ask the question, right, How are you going to get into great universities? You write SATs. Or what's that about? If you check, it's manipulation of quantities, not appreciation of qualities. What's the GMAT and the LSAT, et cetera, et cetera. So what we're doing, we've got a big design initiative on at the Rotman School that is attempting to teach business students appreciation of qualities and of the importance of that in the creation of things that do not now exist but are better than what we now have. The good news is they love it. They absolutely love it. They feel like they're being let out of jail to a certain Back to you, Reena.
So let's talk about how you realistically facilitate this type of thinking, how you do get people to appreciate the qualities and not just the quantity. With specific examples, I know, Daniel, you had a column recently in the Telegraph where you talked about flip thinking and sort of having people, students watch lectures at night and then come into the classroom and sort of work through what traditionally was homework during the day. We're using this environment to facilitate this discussion, which might, spark conversations that might be different and new compared to meetings in the past or panels in the past. What are practical ways that you can teach this type of thinking to business students? Maybe we could start with you,
first
Jim,
of all, I agree with this idea that in education now, people are beginning to question this idea that we come into a classroom or a lecture hall and we listen to a lecture for an hour. We sit in a chair, we take notes. We hear this from our own research when we talk to students and we ask them what's energizing and what's de-energizing. They just don't like this idea that they're going to come in and sit in a chair and listen to a lecture for an hour, take notes, and then get up and leave. They haven't met anybody. They haven't talked to anybody. They don't know anybody in this class. It's just it's an experience, but it's barely an experience. And I think we continue to do it because the technology didn't exist before. So the idea of turning that upside down so that people can absorb information in ways that's appropriate for them. Some people might want to listen to that lecture at night or in the morning. I think that's a terrific idea. And in fact, in business, if I were to take this over to the world of work, companies, managers, executives are no longer willing to walk into a space and have somebody give them a 50-page PowerPoint presentation. We're really resisting that because we're feeling like if it's a complex problem, I'm not going to absorb enough of it that way. And I'm wasting the time where we're together, where we could actually build understanding, we could persuade. Even at the board level, boards of directors dealing with complex problems are asking for a pre-read. They expect to have the information in a pre-read so they can study it on their own, at their own pace. And then when they're together, they want to be able to align as a board around the complex issues, even breaking into committees like a compensation committee, a governance committee, so they can really spend time as a team understanding the complexity of that problem. So if we're preparing students for business, then we should prepare them for the world that they're going to find when they get there, not the world that maybe existed 10 or 20 years ago. Prepare them for a world where you're expected to do the pre-work before you show up. And you show up to interact and to engage and to debate and negotiate and do all these human social things that are maybe the qualities versus the quantities, but the things that really separate good decisions from bad decisions. I think that's where business is going, and I think that's where education has the opportunity to go because of all this new technology.
And Daniel or Roger, do you want to jump in on that topic?
Go ahead.
And said, your homework is to watch the lectures. And then in class, he worked with the 25 students in his class doing the actual problems. because the idea was is that there were many kids, for many of the kids, the regular homework was either too hard or too easy. For the kids it was too easy, they weren't learning anything. For the kids it was too hard, they were getting frustrated and giving up. And this way, people could come together in this space when they were physically present and do the kind of collaborative, interactive work. And, it's a pretty simple solution, but it just makes huge amounts of sense. And it isn't the kind of thing that was either an option A or an option B. It was one of these option C's that Roger was talking about. And if you analogize to the world of work, the same thing is going on. And again, I think it has gigantic implications for interior design and the architecture of spaces. Because now, you can do heads down work anywhere. I mean, you can do it in the back of a cab, you can do it on the bus, you can do it at an airport, you can do it at your house, you can do it anywhere. And so the idea that you have to go into a physical setting called an office building to do heads down work is downright silly. Now, what it means is that when you go into an office, into a physical space, you want to get something valuable out of it. And what you get valuable out of it, in many cases, is, as Jim is saying, some kind of interaction, some kind of collaboration, the opportunity to deal with diverse people, inadvertent contact, and all of that. But in many ways, our workplaces are architected basically as heads-down spaces, rather than spaces where people are actually doing collaborative, interactive work. And so, these issues keep bubbling up in different ways, and it really is a question of, I think, the kind of fresh thinking that Roger's talking about, of saying, wait a second, let's stop here. Instead of trying to optimize a flawed system, let's come up with an entirely new system. Let's come up with that option C, or maybe it's not even option C. Maybe it's almost like option grilled cheese sandwich, that it sort of defies the sort of set of options that we have. And I think that's really where the action is.
Yeah. No, I agree again entirely with that, and I mean, there's this expression which I find completely annoying, but there's some truth to it, which is that which you measure, you get, and I think we kind of measure schooling on the basis of time, right? You're getting a 4-year college degree. You're getting a 4-year secondary school diploma. Your class time is 9 a.m. to whatever 4:30 p.m. Kind of as if that matters kind of at all to anything. And what I think is that a few of the kind of generative experiences that both Jim and Dan were talking about, where people come together for maybe not a long time, but in a space that's organized for them to have a great generative social experience. I mean, that may not be for long, right? You may come into the office for 1 hour and do that, and as Dan said, do all your heads down work wherever the heck you want to do it. And you could say, well, that's a really inefficient use of that office space. How on earth can you ever justify having only 1 hour in the entire day where people were actually in it? Wrong metric. The question is, did it produce something that was actually spectacular? Just like the great, I'll steal that example. Then the school teacher, it's great. I mean, it's like.
Qualitative work that Roger's describing, there isn't this clear correlation between, there's sort of almost like sort of very regularized relationship between time as an input and what you have as an output, and yet we're still hostage of those kinds of things. So our answer in education is not saying let's rethink the system like this teacher is doing. Our answer is to say longer school year, longer class day, as if that's, and it's really, again, to use Roger's parlance, it's saying, should we take option A or option B, rather than saying, maybe we need something entirely different.
Yeah, and imagine, Dan, I mean, what a proposal that to have contact hours in secondary school would be. If you cut it in half, but have all these incredibly powerful generative exercises and then watching lectures on YouTube. I mean, you'd get crucified for saying that. They'd just say, well, you're dumbing down school.
This teacher who put lectures on YouTube, parents are saying, that's not what homework is.
Yeah.
What are you doing? This is not what homework is. Your job is to lecture during the day, and these kids are supposed to work at night. What do you know? And he faced some resistance for that. I mean, so there is, there's kind of there's this bias in human nature that says the way we do things now is not only the way we do things now, but is inherently the right and moral way to do things. And so pushing up against that requires an enormous amount of force.
Yeah.
Speaking of the way we do things now, can we talk a little bit about the future of the MBA, the future of the MFA, and this type of graduate education, how they're intersecting, how they're affecting each other, and we know it's a really tough job market for people with all sorts of degrees, but people coming out of school with these degrees face really, really tough challenges. So if we could address that would be really fascinating, and maybe we could also talk about how Steelcase is dealing with new ways of learning with some of the design that you've been coming up with getting into universities.
So, first of all, we should make the observation that the North America model of business education and of graduate education is the envy of the world. So we see this great opportunity for us to be better, but we're also in a very good place right now. Now, the danger of being in a good place is that you can get stuck there, and that is a dangerous place to be, but we're starting from a position of strength. I think a lot of the things that we're discovering about the importance of cross-disciplinary teams, for example, progressive business programs are beginning to do that with partnerships between the School of Engineering and the School of Business. But if you step back and you think about that, even the fact that we have to work so hard to make those happen show that it doesn't happen naturally. We don't naturally think of business education as something that should, of course, include those other disciplines. And then these students show up at work and they discover that every interesting problem is actually a cross-functional problem. Every interesting problem involves a team of people that are left brain, right brain, and the challenge is being the people who can bridge that divide and can help teams work effectively. So I think that's one place I'd start. The second thing I'd say is we learned something interesting. We were at Steelcase building our own Steelcase University, a place that we were going to use to help develop leaders of the future, teach people statistical process control, some things they have to know in the plant and so on. And something interesting happens. We built this school on our campus where you would go to take classes. And after a few months, the dean of the school came over and said, I got a problem. People keep scheduling their business meetings over in my school.
Interesting.
So we got the school part right. It turned out the school was actually a better workplace than the workplace. And I think it's because these worlds are coming together.
Yeah.
People were just drawn to it. It's become almost like the student union for the company now. Everybody wants to have lunch over there. You meet people you don't see every day. You feel like you're just in a place that's about learning, and you want to have your meetings over there rather than the place that were designed for meeting rooms. So that was sort of interesting. The other thing that's interesting as we study business education in particular, a lot of business education is trying to simulate what it's like when you arrive in the workplace. This is a big deal. Like, you're doing business simulations, you're doing negotiation simulations, you're trying to create more participative ways for students to actually practice these skills, not just learn them and repeat them on a test, but actually have to practice them. And yet the environments they're practicing them in aren't really the kinds of environments that they're going to show up in. At best, they might be the environments that existed 10 or 20 years ago. So I think one of the challenges is to try to lean to the future so that as we create these places for business education, they're modeled after the way that the workplace will look not today, but 10 years from now. Be even more progressive so that they're learning how to practice these new skills in the kinds of environments they'll find when they hit the sweet spot of their career. And that's an exciting challenge for us. And this is why I think this is such an interesting thing. We watch these two worlds sort of come together.
And Daniel and Roger, I know you have an ongoing conversation on this topic. Maybe you could draw us into it.
Sure. Well, Daniel should start because he wrote a great piece. When was that in HBR on the MFA as the new MBA, like 2005 or 6?
Yeah,
7?
somewhere around there. Yeah.
Yeah. So when did you start?
The piece was called the MFA is the new MBA, which ensured that Rotman is the only business school I ever get invited to. So, although maybe I'll be invited to, I'm glad to hear about Steelcase University too. I actually have Steelcase University going to the Final Four in my bracket, so I'm really.
Cinderella story.
But the idea was, as Roger is saying, is that a lot of the traditional MBA skills, these purely kind of analytic skills that are not about iterating something new, that are not about coming up with new options, that are basically about evaluating options and about using these kinds of very much kind of algorithmic cognitive skills, that those kinds of abilities are basically becoming commoditized. We can automate many of them, and we can send them overseas to low-cost providers because Excel works just as well in Manila as it does in Toronto. And so those abilities are becoming, those MBA-ish, traditional MBA-ish abilities are becoming commoditized. But the abilities that some of the students are learning in MFA programs, Masters of Fine Arts programs, are actually a little bit more inscrutable. There are more of these, again, pick up Roger, more of these qualities rather than these quantities. And one of the things that was interesting is the number of corporate recruiters that were coming to these places to hire. And the other thing that's interesting happening in MFA curriculum now is the integration of business. So you have some MFA programs now, or BFA programs, have things like the business of art and design, which is this kind of integrated left brain, right brain thing. So I think that there is, as Jim is saying, this kind of coming together of these disciplines, because I think all of us are realizing, you see these trends everywhere. We're realizing that the world is not segmented in the way that's convenient for academic departments, in the way that's convenient for organizing material. It's messy, it's overlapping. And you see this in people's behavior too. In undergraduate education in the States, there has been a spectacular rise in the last 20 years of double majors and also of self-design majors, because young people are looking at their education and saying, I know what I want to study, I know what I'm interested in, I know how I want to prepare for the future, and then they look at these academic departments which were created in 1880, and you say, wait a second, this does not comport with how I want to do things. So if I'm going to study genetics, then I sure as heck better study some philosophy too. In fact, maybe I need to concentrate in philosophy as much as I do in genetics, and do a major in, say, bioethics or something like that. And so, again, all these things are gurgling out there, and I think what's interesting, and where I'd love to hear from Roger, is the institutional response to this, because most institutions are behind on this. They're not sort of changing themselves in order to accommodate to this. And I think Rotman, in its approach to business education, is doing this and might be a good model for the future.
Well, yeah, thanks. And I have great sympathy with Dan's point on the MFA. The only point I make is that we have an installed base problem in North American graduate education. We produce 1,500 MFAs per year, so 30 per state, and we produce 150,000 MBAs per year. So we're talking 2 orders of magnitude greater. And
that you would think with those numbers that the MFAs would be getting paid more because they're more scarce.
You'd think so. You'd absolutely think so. So my view is that it's doubtful that we're going to be saved by the MFAs. What we have to do is take the best of what that education is and infuse it into business education, which is the grand kind of experiment we're running at the Rotman School. I think a couple things. One, both are important, and I do work with a lot of design schools. I have lots of friends in the design school world, and they certainly are understanding that they need to send their designers out with more business expertise, and so I think that's a good thing. And I do think that there are other business schools, Case Western and Stanford and Darden, to name a few, that are kind of moving in the direction of understanding that they've got to bring this notion of appreciation of qualities into the curriculum. But it's to Dan's question or point, it's a slow process because we the Academy are an ancient institution with these divisions that are for great convenience, right? The reason we have that we teach people things in these silos is it's convenient. And it's convenient for the professors studying those, researching those. I mean, it's so much easier to study a problem when you say all this other messy stuff we're going to ignore, and we're going to study this little piece here in the middle, and so it's a challenge. Now, the way we're taking it on, which people kind of I don't think really understand, and maybe it's because I haven't made it sufficiently clear, is there's sort of two fundamental approaches that you could take on this. One is to say yes, you should, let's say, for instance, study cell biology and philosophy. So you should be interdisciplinary. I think that's right, but I'm not satisfied with saying to somebody, go listen to a bunch of cell biologists teach you as if philosophy doesn't matter at all, and I'm not going to connect anything I tell you to anything that has to do with anything in philosophy. Then go and study a bunch of philosophers who are not going to tell you anything about how that relates to cell biology, and you figure it out. I mean, that's the easiest thing for the Academy to do, but what I think is it produces a massive failure rate. And I know this from business, right, where I observed, I'm a recovering strategy consultant in a 12-step program, but when I used to be a strategy consultant, what I noticed is the greatest point of failure in organizations, as somebody moved up through an organization, was at what I came to call the entry-level integration job. So you take a plant manager who's a really good plant manager, and they manage a bigger plant and a bigger plant and a bigger plant, and then you give them, hey, why don't you take this product line and manage that? And they just fail miserably, right? And the reason is it's a completely different job. It's suddenly integrative. You have to think about marketing and sales and all that stuff, and nobody tells them what to do. They just say, well, you were a really successful plant manager. You should be able to do this next harder thing. And no, massive failure rate at that level. So what's the problem? The problem is that people, it's very hard for people to figure out how to be useful in being interdisciplinary. And again, we know that from our organizations. What's the hardest conversations to have? It's if you're whatever, you're an architect and you're talking to, I don't know, a city planner or something, and you've got your model and they've got their model, and trying to figure out, that's the hardest thing. So what we're trying to do, what we are doing, I shouldn't say try, we are doing, is building the basic science of interdisciplinarity, right? We think that the gift we can give to our students is this basic science. And if there's basic sciences of marketing or there's basic sciences of cell biology, why can't there be a basic science of interdisciplinarity? If you want to be interdisciplinary, here is the set of tools you use regardless of what you're trying to integrate. So whether it's architecture and the city planner architecture and carpentry, whatever, it's this sort of, here's the toolbox you use to be able to understand that dialogue and put those things together with a higher level of success. And so, what we want to do is provide sort of the Linux of interdisciplinary action in the world, and teach that, develop and teach that basic science. That's what we're up to, and it's fun.
So, Roger, I think that's interesting. I was going to just ask you a follow up on that. In business, the way to solve it is you try to create career paths where people have to work across different functions earlier in their career. Like I had to do R&D, and then I was CFO, and then I run sales and 10 years ago, you wouldn't see a career path like that, but today, all my peers have career paths like that. People in other companies do. And yet, in business schools, you still do have this problem. You go over to the design school. It looks like a design school. Your teachers are design professors. The students are expected to understand somehow how to be interdisciplinary just by going to the different schools. But what does it mean for the career paths of professors, or how do we develop instructors in the future who are able to do that kind of teaching?
It's a very good question, Jim. And I'd also just say again, think of how much onus is put on you, Jim, to figure out how to be interdisciplinary with that career path. Did anybody say, Jim, here is the nature of what you're going to learn over in the CFO role, and here's how you should think about integrating it with what you learned in your previous marketing role? No, you're on your own, buddy. Is the name of the game. I think even in good. I mean, I'm not saying it's because of Steelcase is inadequate in this. I see it across organizations, and it's the number one sort of theme. I spoke with a really smart guy whose name I now can't pull out, who runs the interdisciplinary stem cell kind of world at Harvard University, and he was giving a presentation on how he does it, and I said to him afterwards, so I think your theory for interdisciplinarity is if you put them in the same building and give them the same goal, they'll be interdisciplinary. Am I right? And he sort of thought about it for a while, and he wanted to say, oh, no, it's more sophisticated than that. But in the end, he sort of said, yeah, actually, you're right. And I said, have you ever thought of maybe, teaching them something about that? And he said, no, that's an interesting thought. But you see, it doesn't occur to people that there is, we have sciences for all of these other things, and we don't have a science for that. In respect of your question, it's a really interesting, question that I wrestle with every day, Jim. And I've come to believe the following: that a small segment of professors, especially after they've gotten a certain level of disciplinary expertise in one discipline, sort of wake up one day and say, the big story here is how this relates to everything else, and develop an appetite for wanting to be interdisciplinary, and some segment of those develop an appetite for wanting to understand interdisciplinarity as a science. But most would just prefer, one of the reasons why they became a professor is so that they could have deep expertise in their existing field, and as a consequence, whether implicit or explicit, say, I will ignore everything else so that I can go deeper in this area that I want to go deep in. And I don't think there's a lot of choice other than to just let them do that, create knowledge in their field, and then let those few people who are willing to learn the basic science of interdisciplinarity figure out how you take that specialized deep knowledge and put it together with this other thing to do something that's really spectacular with it.
One quick question before we move to audience questions is how physical environment or equipment in the classroom or furniture or tools like this can help facilitate that type of interdisciplinarity. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that. I know, Steelcase and IDEO came up with a Node chair, which has been out on the marketplace. It would be really interesting to see if we could talk about, the physicalness of bringing people together. Maybe they're proof that can help.
Well, there is. I mean, the great thing about education is that educators study themselves. I mean, we're having a rich conversation. Compared to other industries we work in, space is sort of an afterthought for many other industries, but educators are really very reflective, and there's a whole body of research about what causes people to learn more effectively. How can you help people, again, construct their own knowledge? How do you deal with different pedagogies, with different learning modes? And yet, we would walk in, we'd read all the research, and then we'd walk in and look at classrooms, and they were all the same. They were all constructed for a model of learning that broke out sometime in the 50s, and we're all stuck with these desks that are bolted to the floors. So, in one sense, it is so disconnected. The way classrooms have traditionally been designed is so disconnected from the research that the first level isn't that hard. Just like unbolt this stuff put it on put chairs on casters, some basic things about being able to move around. Now, we also listened to students and we watched students and we took thousands of pictures of classrooms and students dealing with different things like how to plug in my laptop, where do I put my backpack. There's just basic human needs sometimes that you're trying to deal with. But we also, as we studied that, realized that if you have chairs that you can move around, but you still have backpacks everywhere, the teachers still can't get to the students. There's so much clutter that they can't move around the classroom, so they can't do this facilitated learning, this more inquiry-based learning that you'd like to see happen. So it's like the teachers know what they want to do, but the physical space is actually in the way a lot. And even if you let them move desks around, the physical space is still in the way. So with the Node chair, we dealt with the backpack, found a way to deal with that, gave people a place where they could set their laptop and not have to worry about it falling over. Be able to turn around and face the person behind you, be able to change from one learning mode to the next. And all of this was based on intuition gained from a lot of time spent just watching people. It was very much intuitive. It was very much, it was hard to prove it. How do you prove that it's really going to, raise grades? So if the whole way we score people in school is flawed, then is it such a good idea anyway to use grades as the measure? But it turned out, we do have a few left-brainers around. So after we put some of these classrooms in, either we would go back and measure, or the professors themselves would measure, and they found that when they moved to a new kind of classroom, all kinds of interesting things started happening. You started seeing the grades improve. One thing I really liked was somebody went deeper than that, though. They said it's not just that the grades improved, but when they were looking at the answers to essay questions, in a classroom that allowed students to collaborate more versus a traditional classroom, the answers were more similar to each other from student to student. Not only were the answers better, but they were more similar to each other. So that would suggest that they're actually aligning around better ideas. They're comparing different ideas as they're sitting in these groups, and they're aligning around better ideas, and then they're playing back an idea that's different and better than what they would have come up with on their own. And so that was really encouraging. It would suggest that the patterns we were seeing, the kinds of research we've been reading, actually turned out to be true. Now, it's not statistically significant, and if you really tore into it, I can't prove it. But I'm glad it didn't go the other direction. And there is evidence that it's working. And then one last point. This is another kind of it's an indirect metric maybe, but to the point that both of these guys made about the danger of measuring the wrong thing. Some of the most important things is about how people build relationships with each other in the context of a classroom. Partially because it makes the classwork better, but also it's just a good skill to have later on in life. A lot of the tough business problems can be solved if people could build deeper relationships with each other, build more trust. How do you measure something like that? How do you measure the strength of a social connection or the strength of a relationship? So you give up and you just measure square footage or something, but there is actually an interesting proxy, which was in a chemistry curriculum. Chemistry has a high dropout rate in a lot of schools. And when they moved to one of these classrooms where students were more interactive, they saw the retention rate increase, so the dropout rate actually fell. And when they dug into it, they concluded that it was because students are actually building relationships with each other more effectively, and they were less likely to drop out of the class. They felt like they belonged in the chemistry program. And we were really encouraged by that, because we don't get very many metrics in this world. You get one that sort of supports what all the intuition was saying. It's very rewarding.
So we have about 15 minutes for questions. Let's see. We have one from online, which is, Daniel and Roger, if you get what you measure, how should we measure creativity in our students? Do we measure competencies, behaviors, value, knowledge? How can we measure creative intelligence?
I'm glad they asked you guys that question, not me.
And this is from Bruce Nussbaum, a friend of many.
Who? That guy. He's a good friend of all of ours, yeah. Well, I guess I think you have to adopt the tried and true methods of the artistic professions, I guess, which is crits, right? Peer criticism, constructive criticism. It's not going to be a single point answer. and people, in that world, get into the graduate program on the basis of showing up with their portfolio, and it's going to be that more subtle way of measuring, I think, and in that world, people are going to get it wrong, right? They're going to do the Vietnam memorial thing, right, where the student who won the competition that was also entered by her professor got a C-, I think, from the professor on this stupid idea for a memorial that's now sort of beloved by everybody who wants to do it. So I think but anyway, I think I would just adopt the tried and true methods of evaluation from that world, I think.
Daniel, do you want to add to that? How?
I think that, I mean, there are some metrics like the Torrance test and other things that measure divergent thinking, that measure creative thinking, and we can take those with a grain of salt. But I think that the idea that something like creativity, you can assign a single number to it, is in many ways a fool's errand. And what you need, you're going to deal with some amount of ambiguity. I think that's the nature of it. And if we can either sort of have a legitimate ambiguity or a false sense of certainty. And I'll take legitimate ambiguity over false certainty.
Do we have any questions in New York? If we do have anybody in the audience, could you please stand right up here? There's a little marker on the floor, or should I think this is fine. Okay, this is fine.
The question I have is very, very simple, I think. We were talking about grouping of people. How would you start to approach the question of a nesting of, say, 2 people versus 3 people versus 4 people in a working setting?
Well, I guess probably Jim would have a better answer. But my view would be, if you don't deliver flexibility, you're going to lose in that game, right? As it feels to me, like I just can't probably imagine that sort of nailing down something that says this is going to be for 2 people space because it's always going to be 2 people, or it's going to be 3 people because it's always going to be 3 people, is probably making kind of a mistake. And sort of thinking about various combinations and having your workspace be flexible to various combinations is going to be the right answer for truly creative activity.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. In fact, I think one of the traps we're in is we're in this world where we had the baby boomers as part of the workforce, and they were such a big part of the workforce, and they were somewhat homogeneous that we got into this trap of designing spaces that were supposed to be, you think about it a long time and you come up with the ideal space, and then you roll that space out for everybody. So everybody gets the same exact cubicle, maybe different sizes based on status, but it's basically the idea of a standard. We're all going to adapt to the standard. And today we have a workforce that's nothing like that. You've got the baby boomers on one end of the spectrum, you've got millennials at the other end of the spectrum, with very different ways they think about work, and indeed, even within each group, enormous diversity in the ways people want to absorb information, the way they want to concentrate. We learned this at work, we learned it at school when we talked to the people that are under 30. Any attempt to stereotype them fails almost immediately. You talk to a few and you think, oh, these are the people that are really good at working in really chaotic, noisy environments, airport terminals and Starbucks, and they don't mind having all this distraction around them. And then you talk to a few more of them and they go, yeah, I hate working like that. I need to be in a quiet place. And so if you are not careful, you tend to pick a new archetype and say, well, that's going to be our model. So every 2-person conference room is going to look like this. And I think the answer is you actually create a wide array of spaces, and then you trust that people are going to find their way through that. The people who want to have space, want to have a work style that's more energetic, with lots of people around, they feel that stimulating, they're going to find a way to spend their time in these places during the day. And the people who are more reflective and want quieter, more concentrated spaces, they're going to find a way to make that work. And same is true for these collaborative spaces. You have some teams that by nature are going to have Post-its up all over the place, and they're going to want to fill every inch of the wall with information. And they're going to find the spaces that are designed for that. You have other people who find that to be really distracting and chaotic, and if they're making a decision, they don't want all that around them. So I think, to Roger's point, the idea of actually designing diversity into the solution allows then the people to find their way through that space.
Thank you.
What about, Jim, what about sort of configurability? That is, what about giving people the freedom to configure and reconfigure the spaces, rather than saying, hey, we got this option over here and this option over here? Is there any move to allowing people to essentially fashion it in real time and then in some ways maybe even disassemble it so the next group comes along?
Yeah, absolutely, Daniel. And that we're actually building a space at Steelcase now, our new innovation center, and we're designing it around that idea that we might have one team developing one kind of product, and they'll be using that space for a few months, and then another team comes in. They're different people, and it's a different problem, and they're going to want to have a different kind of space. So having more things that can configure, almost like a stage set, where you think of the building almost like the studio, but then you've got stage sets that you can construct and deconstruct, and if you can do it in a smart platform-based way, it's sustainable because you're not throwing stuff away, you're actually reusing it, and a lot of it these days is based on technologies too. Being able to, for example, if I have a project that's a global project, I have to know that I can connect my engineers and designers in Europe and Asia to the team in North America, and yet the next project might not have that requirement. So I have to be able to turn technology up and turn technology down based on the needs. So much more flexible spaces helps you with that more diverse workplace.
Do you think that there's some clues, Jim, in the workarounds that people do in sort of reconfiguring space that isn't necessarily built for collaboration? I mean, I know you guys do a lot of ethnography, but it seems to me you go into any workplace and people will have in some fashion reconfigured it to suit their needs. And I always think, man, what if we kind of went with this grain of what they were trying to do rather than oppose it?
There's no doubt about it. In fact, we have anthropologists and sociologists that go in and they take all these photographs, and that's often what they're looking for. How have people actually modified their own workplace to achieve something different than it was designed in? And then we try to turn that into product and sell it.
So we have a question from Toronto that's related, basically asking all the panelists about key drivers for adapting a physical learning environment to a virtual learning environment. So I know we've been talking about the work environment, but what about the educational space?
I'll start, but you guys should pile in here. I think there's two sides of thinking about what a virtual learning environment means. I think first of all, there's outbound things where when you're in the classroom, part of virtual is that you have this wealth of information now available on the internet, and I think as instructors continue to learn to teach in a world where the internet is always on, it's always available, they can get a question they didn't expect and reach out to find an answer and bring that answer in real time. Also, students could, while they're sitting there, if they have a question, illustrate the question with something they find on the internet that they then want to project and share with the rest of the class. So some of this is not distance learning at all. It's really just thinking about how do we pull in that great body of information and diverse thought and debate that's out there and bring it into the classroom setting and do it in real time so you don't have to think about it too much. And then the other part of this is, well, what about people who aren't in the classroom? How can people join who maybe couldn't be there physically? How could they participate in a rich way? And there's some basic things here around just being able to see and be seen, hear and be heard that are pretty bad right now. And so there's a lot of opportunities to improve that. Just we all know what it's like to be on the wrong end of the conference call. Where you can't hear what's going on, or people get up and they move away from the microphone. This happens in classrooms all the time and can create very frustrating learning experiences for people that are someplace else. But the technology keeps improving. We keep playing with it, and I think that these kinds of environments that are not just inbound, meaning pulling information in, but also outbound, being able to have true presence of people that aren't physically present is something that's going to be important in the future. You guys.
And we have about 2 minutes left.
Okay, yeah, I'll be very quick. I mean, I would just sort of kind of echo the themes of Jim and put a frame on him. I think one message is that Jim is giving it important is just subtleties. It's not sort of everything online is different than everything in the classroom, as Jim said. There's subtle mixes of what you can do and what both media are or formats are better for. So that, I think, just parsing these things more tightly than virtual versus there, as Jim has done, is important. The other thing that just strikes me is it's just such a great case of the clash of how people want to be, right? So especially, let's just say remote work. I mean, that's a response to how people want to be vis-a-vis their home life. I don't want to drive in. I want to be close to my kids or my dog or my home, or I like working out of my home. So that's very much something about socially where they want to be. But it's a clash with, then they often impoverish their social environment at work, right? And they become very sad. So you have these people who get all excited about working remotely and then are totally depressed about it 6 months later, saying, I kind of hate my job. It's no fun. Whereas they love their home life. So it's this clash of these two things, and the kind of the real winners in this game are going to be the firms and the companies like Steelcase, who figure out how to facilitate somebody getting the social experience out of both, rather than sacrificing one social experience for another social experience. And I think that's where we're at now. So we sacrifice the home social experience to have a good social experience at work. Now we're sacrificing the work social experience to be at home, and the next generation will be you figure out how to do both.
Daniel, do you have something to add to that?
No, I mean, I think in some ways the virtual learning environments right now, I think we're going to look back at them and see them, 10 years from now as incredibly primitive in the way we might look at, say, the early, the websites from 1995. And I just think that it's, I think you watch what people do. And get lessons from what people do. People want to reconfigure and design their spaces, and they'll in some ways figure it out. And if just the designers watch that and go with that, I think that there some really great things can happen. I think it's a really exciting area because, again, in spite of all the progress, I think that we haven't seen anything yet, and we haven't quite cracked the nut on how to do this in a really, really effective way.
And Daniel, I think it speaks to your point about designing in ways that goes with the grain versus designing things that goes against the grain, that forces people to do things that are uncomfortable. And we're trying to do that, but I think that is the key. Roger, you made the same point, but I think that is the key to really try to understand, what do people want to do naturally? What are the things that they're doing as workarounds? So you can figure out which way is the grain actually going. Yeah. And once you figure that out, then you can design for that.
So just to be fair, we have a question that came in from DC. So we have time for one question from DC. Yeah, so we're going to try to get that in.
One of the backup singers.
Yes, one of the backup singers. We want to hear their voices too. So it's a question for Roger. In your book, you talk about the importance of business people thinking more like designers. So could you speak to examples at your school about how you make this happen, and how you encourage the more tenured professors to embrace these changes, that we've been talking about all day?
Sure. In terms of teaching our students how to think more like designers, an example would be we have a design thinking practicum that is half Rotman students and half Ontario College of Art and Design students. And what they do is they get an assignment from a company or a nonprofit organization where they go out and do ethnography, do deep consumer or user understanding, and then they do visualization, brainstorming, prototyping, bring those users back in to check out the prototypes, etc., and just essentially learn to think more like a designer. Though from the start, that what they understand is what they have to end up with is a strategy for competitive advantage and winning in whatever result they come up with, which is the learning for the OCAD students, which is the entire process is tied to strategy in an integral way from the start, not bolted on at the end. So what we've tried to overcome is bolting on some fuzzy front end to a strategy process for the business students, and bolting a strategy process after the cool creative part for the OCAD students. And the cool thing is that they both love it. They absolutely love it, and they love working together. They absolutely love working together, and that's very encouraging. In terms of the tenure stream professors, that's just what we try to do, is make it exciting and interesting for them to go over and check out what's going on at DesignWorks, which is what this is called, DesignWorks, and try and get as many of them as involved as possible. Some are interested, and others are not, and that is the nature of the academic world.
And on that note, I think we'll conclude this part of the conversation. Clearly, conversations are going to keep going forward on this topic among all of us and people online, etc. So thank you to Steelcase, thank you speakers, and thanks everybody else.
Thanks for being a great moderator.